Welcome. My name is Adam Koplan. I am the artistic director of the Flying Carpet Theater, and we're delighted to be doing another one of our family history podcasts. I'm joined by my co-host, Pete Candler, Dr. Pete Candler, and William McMillian as our guest today. Quick intro of William McMillian. I've known William for many years now. He is, in fact, the design brainchild of the Flying Carpet Theater for our logo and the look of our website. And so, a quick story about that. When we were looking to do a rebrand maybe 10 years ago, I was asking around to a lot of people, who should I get to do this? And somebody who I trusted very much, one of my sister's best friends, said, the person who has to do this is William McMillian. He's got incredible taste and a great eye. We worked with William, and it was one of the most fun experiences I've had to get a series of logos pitched. And it was really like I felt like I was in a TV show. We went to their office in the Navy Yards in Brooklyn, and it was like at a central casting of design. All of the tables were this gleaming, beautiful white. These Mac computers all lined up, perfectly spare, elegantly framed posters, bookshelves that were all tied. It looked like I'd gone into some Danish museum. And then William had all of these logos on, behind a little cloth, and he kind of revealed them one at a time, and we discussed them for what they were. And so I think we probably will not end up talking about my various obsessions with not sans serif fonts and stuff, but that is in fact something we could go down. Instead, pardon me?
I'm up for that.
Oh yeah. You never know. You never know. But what we will, as it turns out, William has been Pete. Pete and I are relatively new to the family history research game. William's been doing this for quite a long time, and I learned that recently, and it started a conversation, and I'm very eager to get a chance to chat with him. His family roots are on this American soil going way back, and so we're going to get a chance to hear about that. So, Pete, any updates or news before we dive in?
None of substance. No.
Perfect.
None worth
Good,
sharing. Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So, William, welcome. We're so, first of all, grateful that you're here. We start off these days with the following question, which is, can you tell us about an ancestor of yours that you find especially interesting?
Well, I can. We talked about this when we were pre-talking before this conversation, and I was kind of racking my brain about who I was going to talk about because my family has very deep American roots, but we're not related to presidents. We're not related to generals. But our history is of people who came to the United States wanting a better life from wherever they came from, which is mostly Europe, England, Germany, and Scandinavia. And they wanted to come here and better themselves. Basically what they were doing. One of the guys I wanted to talk about, and we can talk about the journey of where I've been going through all these years, is where I ended up in a surprise. It's William Spear, and that's the first connection that we found with the Daughters of the American Revolution. He fought the Revolutionary War. Originally from the South. It's interesting that my mother's family is all Southern: Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Alabama. My dad is primarily Northern and the Appalachians, so you get your West Virginia in there and your Kentucky and Tennessee. So William Spear, I happened upon by accident. We were trying to find someone in the Revolution, and I was, racking my brain for, okay, this connection to that connection, and trying to find, because they want direct lineage. That's one of the organizations. So they are very stringent on who you have, and they kind of help you a little bit too. So William Spear, they are basically founders of Maryland, the Spear family. They came over very early, farmed, it's all agriculture. They had a lot of children, as most do. But when the Revolutionary War came, all of the brothers seem to have signed up. So he signed up. His brother was a captain, so they fought in a lot of battles. They had two times. They re-upped 2 times and fulfilled their obligation. The funny thing about this guy is that his history is far more interesting after the Revolutionary War than during the Revolutionary War. They moved a lot of places and had a lot of farm land, like 40 to 300 acres was kind of the average. All of his children lived close by. It seems like that's a thing, is that they're all communal. They have family, that family stays close, they increase the acreage that they have, and it goes forward from there. So in the end with this guy, what's funny is he ended up in Alabama. He followed his children down to Alabama. And when he did, he became kind of a celebrity. And there's a monument to him, and the Daughters of the American Revolution chapter is named after him. But he was known for going to the 4th of July parades, and he was kind of the celebrity, being an older guy. He also didn't apply for his pension until he was in his 90s, which was odd. When he was asked, they said, why did you wait so long? And he's like, well, I was relatively well off, and I really didn't need the money. But I'm getting up in age now, and my wife could really use the pension money. So that was kind of the guy's story. But
So this just to clarify on a dates level, he's like in his 20s in like the 1770s, and he's applying for pension in the like early 1830s or 40s or something like that.
He lived until 1859.
Oh, okay.
But he was born in 1758, so he was lived to be 101 years old. Oh, yeah. But he didn't apply until his 90s.
Okay, so this provokes a bunch of questions for me, and I'm sure for Pete too. So, do you want to go first, Pete?
Well, I'm curious, where in Alabama did he end up?
Birmingham.
In Birmingham. About what time did he end up there?
In the 1830s.
Okay, so Birmingham must have been pretty young at that point.
I don't think it was a super old city. I mean, a lot of Alabama cities weren't, super developed until the 1820s and 30s, when cotton business kind of took off.
Yeah.
So, this fellow, before we even get into the specifics of William Spear's life, you seem to know a lot about the dates, battles, his applying for pension. Where did you find these documents? How do you know anything about his life?
Well, that's what actually was very good about working with the DAR. When I got to a point and realized that it was like the Brake family was married into the Spear family, and that's where I kind of started to find all those connections. But when I found those connections, I was talking to Adam about, I really like to have super backed up documentation for myself before I technically add it to my ancestry list. So I have to double and triple check these people, because there's so many names out there and there's so many ways to find someone. It's really great to kind of like try to find documents. If my parents have any documents about any of the earlier people in the timeline, helps, parse backwards. So, with this guy, like I said, the DAR really helped with like making those connections. And then after that, there were so many people through the DNA test that are actually related to him. I think there's 300 people that I've connected with since I took my DNA test, and I found out that he was part of my family, that they've had documents. I've never found a photo of him. I've never found a painting of him, even though he lived, into the 1850s. There could have been a photo of him as a very old man. I never found any of that, but.
Okay, but let's, so So you're doing your family tree. You come across a name that seems like it's got these revolutionary roots. Like, help us, and for people who don't know, I don't know much about the DAR at all. Help us, like, walk us through the process of, like, I think I may have had an ancestor in the revolution. You contact this group, like, just walk us through what all of that is, because I don't know, it's hard for me to picture.
Well, so, and it's funny because this guy was the first guy that we did get confirmation he fought in the revolution. But I started with another guy that was a dead end. It was actually his brother that fought, and I'm not directly, linked to him, so they didn't accept that. So what you have to do is you have to, like, working backwards. It's what I do with this stuff is I look at the dates they're born. Like, okay, clearly this guy is 20 years old at the time of the revolution. It works like this with the Civil War too. The Civil War started in the 1861. If the guy was born in the 1840s, you could pretty much guarantee that he was involved in some way in the Civil War. So that's kind of where I've gone with trying to find that. And sometimes there are older people who fight, and sometimes they're like very young teenagers that are fighting in wars. So that's kind of how I started to figure out, like, okay, I've got 4 people that could be within that acceptable timetable. I'll check out these guys.
I'm curious too about the process with the DAR, and I like Adam. I don't know that much about them, but so and maybe this would help other people who are watching. How do you go about finding documentation or approaching them, and what sort of mechanisms are there to find this documentation?
Well, so I'm a Midwesterner. I grew up in rural Missouri, and it's a funny thing that, like, out there are a lot of people who have relatives that are of that time frame. And my mom's little town has a chapter, a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter, that has several families that are involved with it. But that's where I took this information and gave it to my mother, and she applied through that chapter of DAR. So, and then there's a main chapter in Washington, D.C., and they send that information for confirmation that they help you fill out and send it forward. You have to have all the dates and stuff correct, and they will help you with that too, if you seem like a viable candidate to be able to join.
So they'll do so let's say, I think my relative John Doe, I look up online that there's an Atlanta chapter of Daughters of the American Revolution, and I have a suspicion that my ancestor John Doe fought in the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I through online or the telephone contact them and say, I think this is the case, and they sort of walk you through. When you say they help you with research, did they actually provide you with some sort of documentation once you started?
I think they did help with the final connections between the last couple people, but it's all based on what you have given them, and you are primarily doing most of the research. But they have a research library in DC that you can go to. I've never been, because I've never run down to DC for Daughters of the American Revolution research. But
right.
You can actually go in. They have a pretty extensive library of people that are involved, and I'm telling you, this could have never been possible back when I first started this, because it's just very, very complicated.
These kind of digital, yeah. This may just be the dumbest question, but sort of like, what are the perks of becoming a member or whatever? I mean, are you a member now of the DAR? Because
I can't be, because I'm not a daughter of the American.
So you have to be a daughter. It's like
they have like a rewards program and some discounts.
My kids are children of the American Revolution. There's a chapter for them too. So they do scholarships, and they do like what a normal, like, non-for-profit organization would do. It's outreach. It's they do community stuff. I mean, it's a great little organization. Like, I think if you're not a member of it, it's kind of like an obscure thing. But there's so many. There's a Jamestown like chapter of their own thing. People who were arrived in Jamestown Colony. I'm sure there's a Plymouth Rock one too.
I've all kinds of questions about the DAR, and we could, that's a separate conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe. but I found this fascinating, the idea that, you know, they actually had all of this resource material that then made it available to you that you probably wouldn't have come upon so easily any other way, maybe.
Well, there's a lot of the records that fall from the actual, you know, papers. You know, now on Ancestry, there's like all the pension applications, the enlistment forms. I mean, that stuff's really hard to read. So it's good that you can have someone who can help you get through that with their extensive library of stuff. I mean, they have everything. Like, if you were researching it on your own, I was reading some information prepping for tonight, and I was like, I can't even read this. If it wasn't transcribed by someone on some of these sites, the writing is almost impossible to read what they're saying on, you know, a pension paper or an enlistment form. You know, it may be spelled incorrectly. It's just so many things that, you know, makes it much more difficult. That's why it took so long to get to this point.
Wow. It's interesting. Like, this is in a way, this is a topic we haven't much discussed, except maybe a little bit with Joel, one of our previous discussants, about sort of communities that help people get data. And so for you, like, one of them, I'm sure there were a few, was Daughters of the American Revolution. In doing my research, as it turns out, like, for Jewish genealogy, there's a surprising number of local chapters of genealogical societies, and usually their members are incredibly generous with their time and expertise. I've worked a little bit with the Jewish Genealogical Society of, I guess it's Atlanta or Georgia, but it's again, we've talked about this before as the kind of number 2 American hobby. It shouldn't be surprising that there are all these support organizations, but, you know, in a way, it feels like they're a little below the surface. You know, the people who do it know about them, but it's not like you know, if I walked next door and mentioned either DAR or the Atlanta Jewish Genealogical Society, I bet my neighbors on both sides would be like, "What are you talking about?" You know.
Yeah.
Pete, have you worked with any of these support organizations?
No. I mean, I hear the DAR, and I've always sort of in my mind, you know, I've done a lot of kind of not direct work, but writing and thinking about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is sort of like the Civil War version, or the Southern version during the Civil War.
You have a Sons of the Confederacy. There's several Confederate ones too.
But they're let's say complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, to be polite.
You have to question your membership in
they're
should I?
It's not an organization. I'll put it this way. I once met a president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Selma, Alabama, and that was not a conversation I sought out.
Yeah.
It was revealing in all kinds of ways, but I've, you know, and I'm just reading about the DAR, like it was founded in 1890, which strikes me as, you know, that's around the UDC was around the same time. So
it's late.
Very late. Yeah, I would have thought it was much earlier than that. So
yeah.
Interesting. But no, I've never worked with any of them. The DAR, I mean, I'm curious now because I might, you know, that might be something I would be interested in pursuing a little bit. But
I think if you have anyone in that revolutionary time frame or earlier, it's definitely an organization to look into, just because they have the kind of records that seem a little harder to get any other way.
So the William, and did you pronounce it Speer?
Speer, yeah. You know, of course, it's spelled like a couple different ways on different forms, but.
And it's, how is it I just wrote SPEER or I?
That's right, but it's AR too in some documents.
Okay, so and you learned about him when, like what year, roughly?
Oh, I don't know, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay. So it
This
wasn't
is when I
somebody
kind of
that
really dove into all this.
it wasn't somebody that you'd grown up with as sort of part of the family mythology.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Like I think most families, you know, a certain. Well, I think my family knew a little bit further back than most families, but he was beyond that point. You know, of we've got him in a record, we have a photograph of him, or knew where they lived, that kind of thing. In my family, that goes back 4 or 5 generations, and then there's a drop-off point where you gotta have to start doing your own research if you want to go any further at that point.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting. You told me in one of our conversations that you share something with. We've got a very limited sample size of previous guests, but you will be the third person who has at least one parent who's a history teacher, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Like on Inside the Actor's Studio, Lipton said that the most common thing that he found sitting there and talking to actors was that they were children of divorce.
Mm.
And I'm finding, again, limited sample size, but
Yeah.
people often have a connection to parental interest in history in some way as being.
Well, my mom's an art teacher, so.
Pardon me?
My mom's an art teacher, so it's like.
Oh, yeah, both sides. You're like the perfect fusion.
I know, I kind of is. But so my dad was a fifth grade history teacher and principal. So our summers were basically getting drugged around to every battlefield site in the Midwest and historical, either a fort or some Mormon, like encampment that they had at some point before they moved out to Utah. So I really have seen it all in the Missouri, Iowa, Illinois area.
And was your dad during this era, at the same time he was kind of showing and modeling how important history was by placing a value on all of this and clearly teaching it, was he along the same time saying, and this son is why it's so important? Like, was he kind of pushing a grand vision of history alongside?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, I definitely, that's one of the things I share with him is that love of history. And as I'm doing this over the years, like he's the first person I would call to like, oh, you'll never guess what I found out this week about, this line of people. So I've always kept him up to date and sent him photos that I found and stuff of different family members because I know he'd love it, so it's kind of something I know he's enjoyed, I think, too, and we can go through this whole thing.
So your search, in a way, I mean, part of it is like also a family bonding exercise in a way.
Oh, I think it totally is, yeah. And his side, which is the McMillian side, was kind of lost over time. So trying to kind of get that back together was probably the hardest part because McMillian is spelled I kind of found out through a relative that we're Scots. We have our own kilts and all that stuff. But McMillian is spelled over 200 ways. It's M-A-C and I-A-N and E-A-N. It's crazy. I would have never been able to have found, without my relatives' help, I would have never been able to have found some of the stuff I found. It was a complete dead end.
Can you take us back a little bit to the beginning, William, in terms of, I mean, if Pete and I are relative newbies, it's kind of, we're all relatively similar age. What, you started a long time ago as a young man. Talk us through what that moment was like and why you started your search and how you even did it.
Well, I'm trying to think, like, I moved down to Arizona. I followed my college girlfriend down there. She was at Arizona State University and kind of couldn't get a job in graphic design down there. So I was kind of futzing around and I taught myself how to use a bunch of programs that time. So it was good, but I also I think there's like this genealogical center that the Mormons run in downtown Phoenix. I'm like, I'm living in Tempe. Might as well just go check it out one day. I went over there, and I think the genesis of all this was probably the Ken Burns Civil War documentary was probably why I decided to start looking, because I knew there was history in my family. I just didn't know what it was. So that was probably I've watched this. Now the genealogy center is right here, so I might as well go. Okay, so the Mormons run a genealogical center, and they have them in a couple of cities. And anyone can go at that time. I'm not sure how it is now. This was 1994. 94, 95. So I go, and everything is on microfilm and microfiche, and you had to like start off with a card system. It was really complex, and I kind of didn't know what I was doing, but I wanted to find the McMillian side. That's what my first thing was. And as they started to give me the documents on this film, I'm like, I couldn't read any of it. It was all handwritten, and of course, like I said, my family name was all misspelled in all these different ways, and it was frustrating. But I kind of started to figure out how it all worked, and I had my mom's information that she'd given me about our family, and I did make some headway over like maybe the 6 months that I was going in and out of that place. So I kind of took a break after that, just because I started a job, and I moved again. By that time, I moved to New York, and I gave it a break. But doing it on film like that sure was difficult. Let me just tell you. So, but I made printouts, so I still have all that stuff in a folder. I made all the printouts from all that stuff to try to figure it out. And in the end, it matched up with some of the stuff I had found on Ancestry years and years later. So it kind of, I was in the right direction. There you go.
I get that you had some time on your hands, but can you go back to beyond filling some dead time? What was the driver? Why your family history amongst a million other things?
Well, I don't know. Like I said, it's something I always kind of wanted to look into, and I just had the time to do it. And I just felt like there was a lot of emptiness in some parts of my family after a point, and there were stories about them that they weren't proven, and I couldn't prove them. Pete, this is a really interesting story here. So Midwesterners, there's the whole what's her name, Elizabeth Warren story. Okay, she felt that she was Native American Indian. Okay, a lot of Midwesterners feel that way, and my father is definitely one of those people.
Hmm.
The story was that we were Cherokee Indian descendants, and somewhere along the line, that's where it became part of our family history. And of course, this was completely disproven through DNA later on. But the story was that really we are, we're Indian descendants. So every time I hear Elizabeth Warren's story, I feel for her in a way, because my father was he didn't get into college because of it or anything, but he had that same assumption, and I think a lot of Midwesterners do. They were early pioneers, and their looks may look more American Indian, and it's something that happens a lot.
Can I ask you about that part of this, which is you approach this kind of research with a received narrative, and in the course of your study and these things you're uncovering, sometimes that received narrative falls apart a little bit, or entirely.
It does constantly.
And so, what was that like? Well, first of all, what was that like with respect to this particular story you just shared? And were there other moments where something you learned deconstructed the version of your family that you received?
Well, I kind of approach this in a way that, like, these guys were kind of who they are, and I have to accept that, and has no bearing on who I am in some ways. I knew that my mom was a big Southern family, and they've been here since almost the beginning of the South. They moved around and then ended up pretty much in Southern Missouri, and did a lot of county founding in Southern Missouri and farming. But, I guess everyone starts this whole process thinking they're related to some great person. And I don't know if I ever really felt like that was an important thing. I really just kind of want to know where they lived and how they lived. And like, I started off like with a very linear thing. Like, I want to know mother, father, and then I started adding children. But I really just wanted a straight thing straight out. But then as I started to look at some people, I wanted to know like where they lived. And if there was a will with the county, I kind of wanted to see how much land they own, and the census records made it kind of interesting. Now, some of the census records you don't want to know, but I mean, they lived how they lived, and they lived where they lived. And I just find that all interesting. They were mostly farmers, and I don't know, like I'm very happy with where everyone's at and what they did. And, you know, there's not any real big historical figure, but they live near historical figures, especially the Virginians. You know, that's enough for me. I don't have to have some crazy story, you know, of.
Yeah, well, and I want to say one thing about your, how you got into this by just wanting to go fill in the lines
Yeah.
and like figure out, just map it all out or
Yeah.
tree it all out. That's one reason I have 16 linear feet of whiteboard on the wall behind me, because I started doing this with just one section of my family, and it got so out of hand so fast.
It can.
The entire wall is.
That's great.
But the other part about this, like the relationship to, we've talked about this a number of maybe every time.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of the great men theory or great men theory of history. Here history is just a series of acts or the great deeds of great white men, and that's pretty much how we were all taught history. But like not having a connection to that, as you've described it, doesn't mean that that your family's history is any less historical.
Absolutely.
Or any less relevant to American history. In fact, it helps to show how removed one can be from this abstract theory version of history that we all got, and still have made huge contributions or taken part in this American experiment in a significant way, even though it wasn't like headlines.
Yeah.
So I found that part really intriguing. This idea, that you were, almost apologetic about having no generals or presidents.
I just came to accept that just isn't a reality. But still, like I think when I find out interesting things about people that maybe other people won't find interesting, I'm like proud of what they did. Like I think that you move somewhere and you're basically scraping your entire existence out of a forest to begin with. I mean, it's incredible, like, and those people survived and moved on and moved west, had a lot of children and, had careers in the military. Like I don't know. I've always just found it, like, I've been very satisfied. Like, I think I like doing this just because it's interesting and you're going through history, but it's also very satisfying when you add new things, and just new information satisfies me with stuff. It's little things like, oh, I just found this guy's pension paper, or I found a document somebody else posted about the family that they're, kind of on the fringe related and married in, but they somehow have this document. I love that stuff.
Pete, you said something that I'd like to ask both of you how you think about it. You said, as you look at all this stuff, you're still, part of the American history. So like for you, even just in that frame, like when you're talking about looking back and, the word contribute, it seemed like, the conception of looking at the ancestors is very much intertwined with a sense of country or a sense of place. And I'm curious how true that is for each of you, if it conjures thoughts of what it means or meant to be American or Southern or, from Missouri or Virginia. I ask because I can tell you, looking at my own family history, frankly, it brought up a lot less about place and a lot more about ethnicity and kind of tribal origin. And I know that's not true for everybody, but I ask because I'm very curious that how much of it, as you look back, or you think, oh, an American farmer, a Southern, how tied is it to land and country?
William, you I give you the.
I don't know. I mean, I think. Listen, I mean, I do identify more as Southern just from my mother's family, and I don't know. Like, I think I found more and more out about my father's family that they were more Pennsylvanian, you know, and they were there early. They had a farm near Gettysburg at one point. One of the family members. I don't know. Like, I'm proud that they did what they did, and I don't know. Like, I have a very big Scottish origin, but I don't necessarily identify with that. It's more of an American. I'm from these states. You know, I've lived in New York for 25 years. I'm proud that I'm from Missouri. You know, and I've never not been. You know, I don't know if I'll ever really be a New Yorker after all these years, but I do identify more with like a rural American existence, even though if you ask my parents, I've tried not to.
Yeah, I mean, just one comment about your question, Adam. With going back to the Daughters of the American Revolution idea, is so much from what I know about just kind of reading their, scanning their sort of sensibility, is so bound up with the sense of patriotism, and so bound up with the sense of like American identity, and like this genealogy, tracing your lineage to some revolutionary figure is almost cast in terms of giving you this sort of special purchase on the American idea or the American thing, whatever that is. For me, I mean, you know, even though so many generations of my family were Methodists, they were not itinerant, like they were not travelers like, you know, Methodists tend to be now. They are Methodist clergy anyway, who tend to kind of bounce around. That's a big part of the Wesleyan tradition. But they've been, you know, my dad's side of the family has been in Atlanta for just forever. So it was like never really much of a choice. But I do feel like I have. But then my grandmother was like, my dad's mom was grew up in Indiana, like northeast Indiana. Even though her parents had a connection to Atlanta, and so it was kind of impossible to escape that. But I do feel like I have become way more invested in Georgia and Atlanta in the last 5 years or so, just because I have like a comfortable distance from it, maybe. But I pay way more attention to what goes on in Georgia than I ever did, like growing up.
Connected because you have family history here.
Yeah, and I'm much more aware of that family history now than I was a few years ago too. So,
William, for you, when you look at this again, because you know, one of the things I didn't say at the beginning, but one of the reasons why a theater company would do this kind, you know, host a podcast is we have a one-person show series. People in the series tell their life stories consistently, and it's always been an interesting point for me of kind of how people define themselves. What are the kind of categories or buckets that they think about as they, and so as you've done this, have any of the buckets shifted? Do you see your own sense of self shifting because of things you've learned about your family history?
Well, yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, when I grew up in a town of 6,000 people, it's a farming town in northwestern Missouri. I couldn't wait to get out of that town and move to the big city and be a designer. I always wanted to do that. So from the beginning of art school on. And, you know, like I said, I've lived in New York for 25 years now almost. And as I've done this, I think rural life in America and those places that all these people are from has definitely pulled my heartstrings at wanting to at least see some of the places these people have lived. Like a nice road trip would be great when the kids get a little bit older, especially the Virginia road trip because it's so close. I I think that now, kind of the way the world is, I would definitely want to almost move back to like some kind of rural setting if I could, just because I think it's me.
Hmm. And so, you know, and that's connected to kind of this trajectory of who your family has been and seeing that on paper in some way.
I mean, and they were kind of nomadic from where they landed to where they ended up, and I did that too, and just didn't realize that I was doing it. I lived in Arizona and Rhode Island and New York and Missouri, and like I kind of didn't realize I had that in me until I started looking at these people and the fact that they kind of never really settled or they moved on to something they felt was better in their lives. That's me too, and I didn't even know that until I started doing this.
Well, can you tell us about another ancestor that either, you know, again, that you find interesting either for inspiration or for, you know, it provoked some question for you?
Whew, there's so many. You guys have got me all emotional about this now. Yeah, you know, the other one I was going to talk about tonight was John Camden, who is, again, my mother's side. And this family ended up being really big in southern Missouri. Ironton, Missouri is kind of where they all landed and had farms. And, you know, now they're almost all gone. My mom and my brother and I are some of the last of that whole group of people that landed there. But this guy is also, I only pulled him in relationship to William Spear was because this guy was the original guy I was trying to research back to the Revolutionary War. It ended up that his brother was the guy who fought in the Revolutionary War. And so it didn't pan out for me with DAR, but they all had, they were Virginians. They had big farms in Virginia, a lot of land, big families, which was interesting. His brother ended up fighting in Yorktown, which is pretty much the ultimate battle of, it's the last battle of the war. So he had a great history, but John didn't.
It's like the Battle of Helm's Deep.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, they moved from state to state, buying more lands, willing land to relatives. You know, they, again, like I said, they moved from Virginia to West Virginia to Kentucky, and then originally the family that my mom was related to, southern Missouri. So, you know, they were farmers. You know, they had like a big family. So that was one of those ones, you know, we're talking about doing the linear. This is like this humongous tree, and my mom had a lot of the information with this family side. So what she gave me, I could expand upon and, you know, make that tree really big and find out everyone who's there. Again, though, no great history people, but, you know, in their own individual way, they were founders of counties, the first people to places. There's a Camden County, Missouri, that's named after the family. But yeah, I mean, again, like I've always looked at this stuff like in the beginning that I would find someone famous, and I'm very satisfied with where I'm at with this stuff, which is kind of funny. I think it wouldn't be.
Can I ask you about you've mentioned Mormonism a couple times, and so is that a strong tradition in your family, or?
No, actually we're Southern Baptists, so we're
are,
we're not at all.
Oh, no.
But you know what the thing is, though, the Mormons are big in the Midwest too, because they started in Pennsylvania and they worked their way west, and you know they were in Nauvoo, Illinois, which was a big place that I think I went several times as a kid. It was their big settlement in Illinois in the early 1800s through, I don't know, like the 1830s or 40s. It was a larger town than Chicago at the time. So and there were a lot of Mormons in the Midwest, like Missouri. There was a big, I guess it's tabernacles, what they call their church. So there was a lot of people out there that are Mormons, certainly way more than like New York or anywhere. But you know, by knowing those people, that's how I kind of knew about going to the genealogical centers, or that they existed, and that, you know, when I found one that was where I was close to where I lived, I wanted to go because I heard some good things about it. So because they're big on researching their families too.
Yeah.
Can I go down a little bit of a process road with you, William? Like you, there are a couple of things that really strike me at hearing you talk that are certainly very different from my own trajectory with this sort of thing. One is that you started way younger than I ever did, which is awesome. Two, is that so you, in a sense, just encapsulated in your work, you've seen a mini revolution in how people even do this kind of work. Uh, you know, kind of culminating in genomic family history and DNA tests, right? So
Yeah.
you've done a little of it all. But one thing that really caught my ear, especially, is that your mom had some of this stuff in the house. In other words, what kind of documents were you guys sitting on, and were they in the attic, and how old were they, and how did that help you begin your work, and how much of this was on Ancestry, how much of it is in, DAR warehouses or microfiche, how much of it came from the Mormons? Help us, when you think of your big family tree, where does all this stuff come from?
Well, I'm trying to think. Like, I'm sure that I called my mom when I lived in Arizona and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this," and she sent me probably. I'm sure she had a Bible or something like that that had like a line listing of certain relatives. That was a nice starting point. And eventually, I think she sent me she mailed me back in the day before email. She mailed me a rough tree of people's births and deaths, so that I could have a starting point when I did start, looking at the stuff at the Mormon organization. So that was kind of like a rough, layout, basically, if you want to call it a graphic design project. So I might have had 3 or 4 generations of a couple of her families. The Camdens were definitely one of those ones that was. I'm sure we had 3 or 4 generations, if not 5, of that stuff. And there was probably some photocopies of wills, maybe some birth or death certificates that came along with that stuff at the beginning. So it was pretty simple stuff, but that's where most people would start at that time. I think there wasn't like a lot of other things to go looking up. You could find a death certificate, an archive of a newspaper maybe, or obituary. I mean, and I think I got some information from a couple of those too that she had.
We had 0 of that, just none of it.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have that though. A lot of people have like Bible, like listing family members' names in Bibles is a big thing. Like, I know a couple of families that I grew up with that probably did that. If I'm sure I saw it.
It's
Definitely
really
a Southern Baptist thing.
I know.
There's no Presbyterian or Methodist analog to that, I don't think. I mean, if there is a family Bible on either my mom's or dad's side of my family, I've never heard of it. And
yeah, my mom
maybe
kept good
somebody has
records.
one.
My mom kept some good records to start with. I mean, I
Yeah.
definitely think she was a good help for this, for me anyway. But yeah, so then like the DNA, like Ancestry, when they first kind of kicked off in like the 2006, 2000, they had an early DNA test that didn't tell you anything. It told you like what tribes you were from Europe. It was like maybe a 3 or 4 page PDF file of like your genomic breakdown. But it certainly isn't like, I don't know, Pete, when you've done yours, but have you done the Ancestry?
I haven't actually done.
It's really, it gives you if your tree's built out on Ancestry and you use the DNA, it will definitely hook you up with new people.
Yeah, that's the part I'm a little worried about.
You know what? Some people really are worried about that.
One of my cousins, as I was doing the DNA test, said something like, I got enough headaches with the family I know about. What do I want with the family I don't?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm still trying to unpack the family secrets that I've, there's a lot of material there. Just trying to manage all that, pace it out.
Yeah.
But I've got one that's in a box right over there that my brother-in-law gave me for Christmas a year or 2 ago, and I haven't done it, but maybe I should.
It's filled in some gaps for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, if you're stuck with some area and you're kind of like, I don't know, like I definitely would say that it helped. I know there's like the privacy issue and that stuff, but I don't know, like I kind of just let that go a little bit. I don't know.
That proverbial ship has sailed a long time ago anyway, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
But now the sort of database of information is so vast compared to what it was when 2006 or whatever. There's just
Has anybody reached out to you, given that you know a lot and you've been the person that's helped somebody else fill out their family history?
It's funny because a lot of the people that I'm like, like we were talking before, where I just did the linear stuff and then I filled in later like other siblings of people. I've definitely run across a bunch of people that have used my photos for their own trees because they were related to DNA, and I'll look at their tree and like, oh, there's the photo I've got of that person and that person. So, Pete, I have a lot of photos on my tree. Like I've been able to dig up a lot and get from my mom a lot. She's got a lot of photo books.
So
4 or 5 generations back of that, and I'll always see those people like they'll copy paste it for grandpa or great 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 grandpa or whatever. So
what do you do with all of this information? This is again sort of a procedural technical point, but what do you do with all that? Do you like post it on like a website and share it to your family members? You just kind of keep it in a box? What?
it's kind of in my digital box of ancestry site.
Yeah.
Like I do share it with family members, and you know there are a lot of family. I mean, you guys have probably found this. A lot of family members don't care about any of this stuff. Like my wife doesn't really care that much. My brother really doesn't either. But my daughter, who's 8 right now, she'll sit with me and we'll go through the tree and like, oh, look at this photo and that, and she's genuinely interested in it. So that's my hope for the future, is that at least they'll know something about their family, however good or bad that may be, down the road. Because I think I feel like people kind of need this. I need it. I need this in my life. Like you know, you're just floating alone. And
Can I, not to get too philosophical here, but why do you need it?
well, I think it goes back to the history, like the love of history. I think that my dad kind of instilled in me when I was young. I like to know where people have lived. I like to know what they did for a living and where they're buried and all the weird stuff you shouldn't really care about, I guess. But I like that stuff. Like there's the Find the Grave site that has like, that's a great one because it shows their headstones and where their the graves are. Ultimately, like it would be cool to do them because the DNA on Ancestry also shows you like where all these relatives are, and like clearly from the mapping, it's like colonial Virginia and the Appalachians are, all my relatives are in there, like from the DNA, but they've spread all over the United States over time. I do like that, but ultimately I'd like to find like a map where, okay, this family lived in this county in Virginia and this county in Kentucky, and like know where the places are, and maybe one day go visit some of them. That's kind of like what to have even more of an attachment to these people and their history.
So I think that's what I'm getting at, because I don't want to push you too hard on this, but I feel like you're kind of skirting around it a little bit because I mean, at one lot, you're like, you know, I can tell you love this stuff.
I do.
You know, this is really fascinating and interesting, and you get really curious and jazzed about this. But when you talked about, you know, your did you say your daughter? I think you said.
Yeah.
So when you talked about her, you said people need to know this. That's different than like, this is just really interesting. I mean, so I think you kind of gestured towards it, but I'd love to hear you say more about it when you said attachment. But what is the need? Like, how do you go from what's the step from just finding this stuff interesting to finding this stuff necessary, both for yourself and for your daughter?
Well, I honestly think that it would be nice if more people were kind of interested in this, just from a family perspective. You know, families are so fractured now that like, this is interesting stuff, I think. And we have I grew up with my parents are still together, and my wife and I fortunately are still together. A lot of people aren't, you know, but these people weren't like that. You know, they were together throughout life. I mean, they were married young and had children. I hope that my daughter would be interested in this. I think she's shown somewhat of an interest in it. I'm not ramming it down on her, but she kind of already has a curiosity about this that I think could be, you know, I think she might want to have it cultivated. And I wouldn't want to do all this work for nothing because it will die with me if I don't have someone who cares, you know?
The thing about, so I think we're, to some degree, we're asking questions of you that I'm not sure. I mean, candidly, this comes up virtually every episode, and Pete and I have had, you know, hours long conversations offline about it too. the kind of search for, why do we care? You know what I mean? And like, there's a lot of ways in. I heard you say something about the kind of continuity that I mean, I could almost even hear it in your graphic design brain of like you coming into like building something. There's like a sort of a beauty to to the
Oh
in a
yeah, I
way
love that. Anytime you can
it's almost
expand it,
an
it's
aesthetic as much as anything, like,
it kind of is, yeah.
and I hear that, and also this sense of kind of having, I mean, it's a little bit, it's the common word that everybody uses, but there's something about roots that is primal, and I think we've with several guests gotten to this place where there's kind of like almost a stop of language around it. Like it's hard to express why knowing the roots are important. It just sort of is. Is that your experience, or do you have a kind of if you had to put into words to your daughter why she should care, would you just say, I don't know, it's just, like what would that conversation look like?
Well, I mean, I think so. I just love this stuff, okay? Because people I work with at work are a completely different kind of person than I am. I mean, racially, ethnically, whatever you want to call it. Like, I would love to like see the DNA of someone who's like from Guatemala to see what the mix is. It's like a science project, and that's where some of this kind of works for me too. And it's a science project, and it's a graphic design project, and it's a history project. It's a class in of its own. It's kind of, you're always learning and you're always finding new things. So it's also, you're kind of an explorer with this. So that's one thing. Sometimes I just like take a break from that, because you have to. Like, you can't spend your whole life doing this, but and then sometimes I'm just so into it. I can spend nights till midnight every night for like 2 or 3 weeks doing this. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, like I would like my daughter to just appreciate like where we're from. And I think why I think like this is because living in New York, there are a lot of people who are 3rd or 4th generation Americans that don't necessarily, for whatever reason where they came from, that information's lost, or they change their name. And my wife is like this. My wife is a 3rd or 4th generation American, whichever it is. And there's just, for me, I think I would feel a little empty not knowing kind of backwards a little bit more. That's just me. I don't know why. That's the history interest, I think. But I don't know. I do love it. You're right.
I can speak to that, William. I think you and I have spoken. Your wife and I share even some similar names in our family tree, and there is, I don't have good words for it, but there is something odd about, like, there was something very satisfying about putting names where no names had been on my family tree. It just felt rooting, and like knowing the names and places, it had a comforting effect. I can't even put words to it. And then there's a jarring effect when the thread goes, So I wish it's primal almost. I can't explain it much beyond that.
I know. It just, like you said, like finding that next little thing, even if it's like a date of death or someplace, it's so satisfying, and it happens a lot. Like, if I really get into it, I just can't stop doing it. I'm going to get a kiss. Good night.
That's awesome. This is the continuity. The continuity of it all.
All right. Yeah.
Awesome.
Nighttime around here. But yeah, I think it's like a little victory. It's a rewarding little victory every time you find something new. And
one other, going back to this philosophical thing that I think is very interesting, you used a great word, and it actually, a similar word came up in one of the books I read about this. You used an explorer, right? And people use detective or explorer, that thing.
Yep.
And we're in a modern moment where I mean, we have the luxury of, not having to worry, about some of the things our ancestors did in terms of how hard life was in earlier eras and having a little bit more leisure time. But in the kind of explorers that we are, it's an exploration of self. It's an exploration of personal history. Where do I come from? And one of the books I was reading was talking about that as kind of almost a paradigmatic shift in the consciousness around family history, that we now, with the genomic revolution and all these tools, we have the opportunity to become explorers of the self in a way that we never had been, because each of us can know more about our own family histories and how we got here. And I guess one of the discussion points of the series that, Pete and I certainly don't have any answers about this, but we're always trying to push on is, now that we have the luxury of being explorers of self, what does it add to? And I'll sort of transition towards the end, which is that one of our early guests speaks Yiddish, and she joked with us about, in some moment, where she said, you have to put your tuchus on the table, and she had a Yiddish phrase for it.
Nice.
And we were like, what are you talking about? She said that it's an idiom in Yiddish that putting your butt on the table means like there's got to be some productive outcome. Why do something if there isn't a productive outcome for it, a reason? So I guess I'll go like very philosophical. If you're going to put your tuchus on the table in this work, what do you think the productive outcome for each of us knowing our family histories is? What's the outcome for it that you would hope for if you were the benevolent dictator of all,
I don't know. I think it's just a satisfaction in knowledge is really my own personal takeaway from all of this. It's just, there's never an end. Like for right now, like in Pete, like the DNA is great on here. It only goes back to 5 grandparents, so your 5th level so that's not that far back, in your history. Like it might be the 1820s, maybe the 1800s, depending on how old these people were at, when, they kind of were your great grandparents. So this could go further back. This could go even further back, like it could go 10 generations back in the future, or 20, so it never ends. It's always evolving. I mean, I get updates on the DNA on here all the time with new people who took the test, and they've appeared in my network of people, which is about 95,000 people. So it's hard to go through sometimes. But
well, the other cool thing that I've learned doing, during the series is that, even if this is of like immense value for you personally, it still like has this sort of generative quality for other people. We talked that the information that you discover could be a sort of revelation to somebody else you never anticipated.
Absolutely.
So
thinking about Williams, like the photographs that he's been able to find and catalog, I mean, you can imagine when I find something like that on one of these sites, it's like, you have this overwhelming sense of gratitude for someone you've met before,
Well, and then you like start looking at the photos, and you're like, do I look like that person? Then you start like really digging into that person.
Yeah.
And when you find a photo, it makes you more connected to them. So then you want to know more about just that one person. So it really is never ending. I mean, I've like I said, I've stopped and gone back and taken a break and then come back. There are sometimes you just get on a roll with finding stuff that it's very addictive and you just can't stop it.
Pete and I have kind of revolutionary thinker type bends, like in a way, meaning that Pete and I, when we're just brainstorming, are always like, how are we going to iterate and take this interest and knowledge to the next level and turn it into a social movement? And I'm not going to drag you into that per se, but that
Probably
vortex.
easily could.
Yeah, but given your actual professional expertise, I'm wondering if during this work you've ever either been inspired and brought that into your a design that you were actively doing, or the other way, you've looked at the way historically people have thought of families graphically, and you had an inspiration for a better or a different way to do it.
Well, I from this work, and like I've always kind of wanted to do like some book work with this, like describing a certain branch of people, and that would align with like how like where they're from and stuff would definitely, I think, kind of be the graphic language of what that book would look like, like some rough, cool font, like all that kind of stuff, So I have wanted to do like some actual printed work with this stuff, but I don't know, like it takes time away from doing. If I'm gonna work on this, I want to just keep like researching, like it's almost like a distraction from the actual thing I really want to be doing, and that's just finding more information about whomever I feel like that's the person that needs my attention at the time. So I don't know, like it's hard to describe the feelings I get for this. I think I've tried to during this time, but it makes me happy.
I love it.
Ask too. I had a similar question to Adam's about like as a graphic designer, I bet your family trees like look amazing. Like, I'm curious to
They
see
could.
what they look like.
I mean, I think the photography, like I don't know, like I love photography too. So like all the stuff, like how things are shot. It's funny because I did this in a way. So I did make this kind of graphic designing when I was doing the tree in Ancestry. So like people who were born in the 1940s or lived in the 1940s, the photography was a certain kind of way. It was like a sepia tone thing. So if you look at my tree, like everyone from that area all has the same color of photography. And then the next generation back might be some black and white, might be some color. And then the one after that, it's all black and white, and there's like the stiff faces. So it does relate to what I actually do for a living with a lot of this stuff. So
So you can almost like the visuals of the tree also set it in time and kind of.
oh yeah, yeah, totally. Like my mom and dad got married in the 60s, and their wedding pictures are amazing, And Wendy, my wife's family, got married at the same time, and they got married at City Hall, and they're all like in these little like white tuxedos. They're so cool. So
Pete, have you done anything graphic or visual with your family history in some way?
Well, actually, we had this past week, my aunts and uncles are kind of liquidating a family home that just got sold, and so it was one that my grandparents bought decades ago, and so it's been sort of a repository for a lot of their stuff for years. They died many years ago. But so now I have become the curator of the slide photography collection for my grandfather, and there, over on that shelf, there are, I think, 18 cases of slides, and then in the basement I have probably as many more. And now it's my job between now and Christmas to get all of those scanned and
oh yeah,
and for the family, because it's there. These are Kodachrome slides that go back to 1939, and they're Kodachrome was like brand new then. My grandfather was like it. I have a bunch of his cameras. Adam and I were talking yesterday about the Leica M3 that I kind of just had been sitting in the closet of mine for a long time, and he was a real like photography. I remember when he was still alive, him like showing me a little closet where he had like one of those like James Bond spy cameras.
oh the little
kind
The
of
Minoxes usually.
yeah, he was like a gearhead,
That's cool.
But yeah, speak to if I can sort of gush for a moment about like the beauty of film, and like when you when you see one of these images like in person, there's nothing like it. Like, and it's like a revelation. And
Can I speak to that in a sort of, we rarely are prescriptive in these family history podcasts, but um, I guess one of the things we did in our family, and it's had so much value, and I might recommend it for people who are of interest to it, is the volume of slides and images that we had at one of my grandparents was just so high that the prospect of hand scanning them seemed overwhelming. And there are a couple of companies, including one called Scan Cafe, that the price per scan is quite low. They send it, I believe, to India, and the quality that comes back is really good. And I bring this up because they'll put it in a Dropbox for you. And here's the key as it relates to family history is it goes from being at one grandparent's house. We now have the
yeah,
technology to share it quickly. And there's two insights that I got from this. One is how valuable and how mind-blowing it was for all of these extended family members to see themselves or their ancestors on film from way back and how grateful they were, and the ease that you could click a button and put it on Facebook or send it. And the secondary thing is that for people who like, if stuff isn't labeled, we're at the chance to get stuff identified is
yeah,
constantly evaporating.
yeah,
So the sooner any of us does it, if we have the ability, the absolute fact is doing it now always means there will be more people who can
yeah,
help you identify those people. And we're kind of like the first generation of adults. We're like, in terms of the invention of photography, like we're sitting at that place where there's probably somebody in the family that has some sort of memory of who the 1920s people are. And there usually aren't that many photographs from, that much further back. But boy, if you don't do it now, you might never know. And there's just going to be shoeboxes of stuff.
so true. Amen to that one. I actually had an episode last week when I was talking to my aunt Carolyn about some of these slides, and I was saying I've got a box here that's like labeled such and such, and she was like, it was like, I forget what year it was. It was said von Stroheim on it or something. She's like, oh yeah, that's when Daddy like went to somewhere with Eric von Stroheim. And I was like, who's Eric von
Really?
Stroheim? I know you know who it is, Adam, because
Yeah.
and they're like pictures together. It turns out it was actually, the picture in question was Eric Jr. But he was like, they knew each other, Eric von Stroheim and my grandparents, and I don't know how that happened, but he was like a big filmmaker.
Wow.
And like worked with D.W. Griffith in 1918 or whatever. I never would have known that if I hadn't just casually mentioned that to my aunt. So yes, to get this stuff, like you got to talk to people who, who are, while we still have our grandparents and aunts and uncles, and it's so essential.
And that's another theme. It came up with you, William, and it's coming up to some degree, this is combating I don't know why it is, but there's a culture of forgetfulness in American society around a lot of this for whatever reasons. And you have the opposite bug, but you'll be the guy that in your family has prevented this culture of forgetfulness from disseminated. And there could be somebody 3 generations from now who's totally grateful to you.
It's funny because like my mom, like I was talking with you, like Adam, that my mom is the keeper of all those photos that the family has. And when I first started doing this, she sent me some, and because I'm a kind of crazy graphic designer sometimes, I started scanning them and they had like damage on them, and I started just photoshopping them into like the most beautiful photos I've ever owned in my life. But the one that I love the most is I have in the hallway of my house like 4 of my favorite ones that I really retouched and spent time on. And one of them is my great grandfather and his wife when they were very young before First World War, and he's in his uniform, and they have like that classic backdrop of whatever scene is going on behind them. and I think she was like a nurse or something. So they both were involved. So they were both dressed in that kind of fashion, and the corners were kind of like, I just photoshopped that all. It's everyone comments about that photo every time they come over to my house. Total strangers, friends of my children, they always ask about that because it's such a striking photo that could totally be lost if I hadn't scanned it and taken care of it.
Would you send us a JPEG of that so we can put it?
Yeah, I definitely will.
Yeah, yeah. I, so many, this sparked so many different strands, from the importance of memory to, the unanswerable of why we do it, to, region versus, how we think of region and identity. I really am so grateful for this conversation, William.
Me too.
Before we sign off, I want to give each of you a chance to, little reflection, or if there's anything else that you want to bring up.
Yeah, I'll go then. William, you can have the last word here. I think with each one of these we do, I become more and more convinced of like the importance of preservation and of documentation and all that stuff, and digitally. And I think that what we've observed over the course of doing a few of these is that all of us are kind of coming at a point in history where this collective knowledge of our past was in decline. But now it's like there's an opportunity for this great like reset. And because we have so much more information now, we're kind of becoming more and more aware of what we're losing or still in danger of losing in terms of memory. But we have the ability to preserve this and to kind of hand it out onto our kids, if we have kids, or to the next generation. And that's come up every time we've talked. It's always been about my kids or my nephew or the next generation. And I find that really moving, and just this idea that, this is really fun for us, but it's also like, so my kids receive a fuller story of the world and of themselves within it. That's it.
Well, I think, I started this thinking one thing, I just wanted to know some things about my family. And, like we said, the hope is you find some super awesome historical figure that, you didn't know you were related to. But in the end, that really didn't mean anything. Like, it didn't, in the end, what was revealed was something I think in many ways far more interesting than just that one, like, glimpse of history or something. Like my parents were really big into this, and I think that definitely got me going on it too. But like you were saying, like, I would like one relative that's younger than me to be interested in this at some point, like children or nieces and nephews, or even my brother, just so they kind of knew where we came from. Because one of the reasons I started doing this was like we've talked about, an interest in it. I kind of ran away from a lot of what these people all were doing and stood for a large majority of my life. I wanted to be a city person and have a big time career and stuff like that. But, as I've done this more, and I think maybe even like with COVID here, being around family a lot more, it's the definition of what I'm doing seems like it's changed. It's changed into, I would like people to know in the family who we are, and I want to keep going with this. I don't really see myself ever stopping. Unless I just run into a brick wall that can't be found. There's always something out there that you can discover about people. Like I was talking, like maybe doing road trips when my kids get older, doing a road trip somewhere to hit some spots that people lived in certain states or something, just to see that. Because my children are New York children, they're Long Island children, so they've never been out west. They've been out to see my parents a couple times, but I think they might be interested in that. And if not, they don't have to be.
One of the things that we've talked about a couple of times, and I think, again, Pete and I are still working this out. If you think of this as kind of like the soft launch or the beta launch of, where we're going with all of this, And so some of the stuff we're figuring out right now is distilling down themes and also opportunities. One thing that people have talked a lot about are these road trips or journeys to places that are significant. And I wonder, we may circle back to you with some, maybe you'll go on one and record the heck out of it or something, and that'll be cool. The other thing is, if we end up creating some sort of resource page, we may circle back to you also for either process stuff, but also I think your ability to organize this stuff, I bet, in a way that your family loves looking at is probably very different than what John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public could do. And with that in mind, maybe if you're thinking of anything that would help people look at their trees and just get pleasure from the aesthetics and the visuals of it,
Yeah.
that would be another thing I think that would be really interesting for all of us to ponder.
Yeah, I mean, Ancestry, you can create things out of the account, but I've never really looked at it because I know I wouldn't be satisfied with what they come up with from a stock kind of thing. So I don't know. It's like, it depends on what people want to. It's a personal thing across the board. Like, what do they want to see from their family? What do they want to know? And then how is it visually represented and what they want to pass on, like for every person it could be different. I mean, I definitely know what I want. I mean, listen guys, I feel like a road trip's in our future here.
Yeah.
I know it is for me.
Yeah.
That could be a nice YouTube series of like history trips or something,
Yeah.
No doubt. Well, I mean, just the biggest open-hearted thank you to you, William. Really, it was a delight to be able to share some of this with somebody who clearly has passion for it. And the conversation was really interesting for me.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, thank you so much, William. This has been great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I could go on for hours and hours with this.
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we'll continue we will continue the conversation. We're grateful to you, and we will we'll have something on the site up soon with your stories and et cetera.
Sounds good, guys.
Bye all.
All right.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Big hugs. Talk to you later.
Take care, guys.